Before we jump into today's story, just a few things to cover first. I'd like to start by giving a big thank you and sharing my heartfelt condolences to the family of Tamiqua Gutierrez, who we'll be discussing today. You see, Tamiqua's story is one that I covered close to almost 2 years ago on TikTok. And when I did that, her family reached out to me after seeing the video, which is why we're here today. Her family was able to provide photos, answer questions, and share their recollections of what took place back in May of 2001. We all know how hard these stories can be to revisit, so I appreciate her family trusting me with this. If you saw that TikTok video about Tamiqua, you'll notice that I was pronouncing her name Tamika, and that's because of the spelling of her name in certain papers. But her family did clarify for me that her name was spelled with a Q-U-A at the end and was pronounced Tamiqua, just in case there was any confusion on that. If you find yourself watching today's video or any other on my channel, feel free to leave a like and subscribe. Really helps with the algorithm and making sure that these stories really make their way out there. I appreciate anybody who's given this channel attention and given me their time. And of course, if you're just stopping by, that's fine too. I appreciate you being here. With that being said, I do have to warn that today's video contains some of the worst details I've ever had to cover on this channel. So before you go into this, please keep that in mind. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. If you ever find yourself near Olinville and Burke Avenue in the Bronx, you might be familiar with the many tragic events that have taken place in the area over the years. Whether it be muggings, slayings, or other types of violence, residents who reside here know exactly how hectic things can become, despite the neighborhood's quiet moments. There have been victims of all ages, many of whom were once headlines, but with time, so many of these types of events take place that continued coverage can be very rare, even if these tragedies are known to live on forever in the minds and hearts of loved ones. In May of 2001, residents of this neighborhood would learn the absolutely sickening details of a young child's final moments, in a case that bared similarities to the final moments of children like Jessica Guzman, Davina Henao, and Latasha Goodman.
Little Jessica was found murdered along the Bronx River Parkway on Wednesday, just days before her 11th birthday.
The rape and murder on May 5th of Davina Genoa caused a state Senate committee to re-examine New Jersey's parole system. A former inmate, Conrad Jeffrey, is accused of killing that child. Jeffrey had been paroled from prison 6 weeks before the murder.
Their grief is subsiding. Now the family of Latasha Goodman seethes with anger. The 6-year-old was brutally raped and murdered in Asbury Park on Sunday. Police say 22-year-old David Cooper did it. They arrested the ex-convict yesterday.
All children who came face to face with evil. But in this case, evil was just a few doors down the hall. Her story would leave anyone who heard it heartbroken, and the grief that many felt would be paired with anger and fury when it was learned that the monster who committed this awful crime should have been in prison long before he took this child's life. On today's episode of Evil Intentions, this is The Neighbor, the story of Tamiqua Gutierrez. Tamiqua Gutierrez was born on October 15th of 1989 in the Bronx. She was born to her father, Ernesto Gutierrez, and her mother, Santa Cruz. Tamiqua and her family resided on Olinville and Burke Avenue, with her father working at the Siwanoy Country Club in Yonkers, while her mother worked as a nurse at a nursing home. Ernesto had spent his whole life in the area, and he knew it well. and the family had loved ones in the borough and in Puerto Rico, where they were from. Despite this area having a reputation for being rough, it was also known for having a strong community. Neighbors who saw each other every day, coming to and from work, walking their children to school, running errands, shopping at the same local shops. People who over time would begin to greet one another day in and day out. Some getting to know one another. Others having children who might have classes together or attend the same schools. Most of those here looking to achieve the same goal, to safely raise their families and not let headlines define them. Tamiqua was a part of one of those families. Her and her family resided at 3225 Olinville Ave, an apartment building with 56 units, filled with families, and according to many who were interviewed, it was a nice place where most of the tenants knew one another and were always kind to each other. Nobody bothered anyone. Residents in the building would often see Tamiqua and her family around the neighborhood, and they knew them well from seeing them out and about every day, running errands and going to school. Good people who were known for always being together, a tight-knit family. Tamiqua was the oldest of 3 children, and since she was born, she was known for her big smile and her chubby cheeks, an adorable little girl who was loved and cared for by literally everyone around her. Some friends called Tamiqua Tammy, while family often called her by her nickname, Boo, a slight reference to Betty Boop, her favorite cartoon character. They also felt that given Tamiqua's big doughy eyes, it was appropriate. She was described by her father as a happy child who was always full of energy and had a huge sense of humor, much like himself. Like a lot of children, she found happiness in the simple things, like spending time with her younger siblings, since she loved being a big sister. She was full of love and never failed to show it, always showing affection to her family and her friends. Tamiqua also absolutely adored her family's dog, a small dog named Nini. Those in the neighborhood had grown used to seeing the child walking with her family and walking the dog. No one ever bothered her, and no one would ever even think of it since everyone knew each other. Some of Tamiqua's favorite times growing up were when her and her family would take trips to City Island when the weather got nice. They would get food and enjoy the quality time together. They would also often make the trip from the Bronx to Brooklyn to visit Coney Island. In fact, when May of 2001 rolled around, summer wasn't too far off, and Tamiqua was loving the idea of the hot weather approaching. She was an active child, so for her, the summer meant her being able to play basketball with friends, going to parks and traveling around the city, and going to the beach, which she loved. Tamiqua would attend PS 41 for elementary school, followed by MS 113 for junior high, where she made a lot of friends and did very well. She was excellent in class. She was said to be very bright, as someone who always wanted to make others happy, according to the school's principal. Her mother recalled a time when Tamiqua said, "I'm going to do good in school just for you." She kept her word. People genuinely loved being around her. She loved making people laugh, so spending time with her was easy. The approaching summer also meant that school was almost finished for the year, meaning more time for friends, family, and fun. While attending elementary school, Tamiqua was walked to school just a block and a half away. Her parents kept a watchful eye over her and her siblings, knowing of the dangers that presented themselves in the area. Since young, Tamiqua and her siblings were taught to never trust strangers and to be aware of their surroundings. It wasn't until the start of junior high when Tamiqua began walking to school by herself, sometimes taking the subway the short ride with others. She was always safe and mindful of things going on around her, and MS 13 was only 5 or 6 minutes away. She would often take the short walk with classmates, stopping before and after school to get snacks and drinks. Tropical Fantasy iced tea was one of her favorites. Anyone who got to know her felt like a friend to her. Even at her young age, she knew it was important to be kind. According to her father, Ernesto, a strong support system and tight relationship with family and friends was absolutely essential, and she was loved and protected by everyone. By May of 2001, Tamiqua was getting ready for final exams at school, and summertime right around the corner. Grade 6 was almost officially over. Mother's Day was also quickly approaching, so she made sure to get her mother a gift, and she hid it somewhere in their house so that her mother wouldn't find it. She was thoughtful that way. But on Tuesday, May 8th of 2001, Tamiqua would venture from her school to her apartment building for the last time. because she would cross paths with pure evil. And unbeknownst to her family and the rest of the building, the threat was much closer than anyone thought. On that morning, Tamiqua got ready for school, spent time with her family, and was ready to see her friends in class. She put on her book bag and said goodbye to her family, making sure to kiss her father on the cheek before she left. She would have a normal day at school, and as it came to an end, she was ready to make her way back home. Classes normally let out at 2:30 in the afternoon. On the days that she decided to walk to and from school, Tamiqua would normally make the trip with a friend, both going to school and coming back home. But this afternoon, Tamiqua was last seen by her friend during 8th period class. She was a few minutes late after class let out, so she assumed that Tamiqua left, and so she did the same. Tamiqua made her way home like she did many times before, and she made it to her building. She was last seen by a resident entering the building by herself. Nothing was wrong. She entered the elevator and hit the 6th floor to where her family's apartment was. But after exiting that elevator, she would never make it back home. Some reports early on in the investigation stated that Tamiqua made it home and went back outside, but that would later be clarified. It was close to 3:30 p.m., and Tamiqua still hadn't made it home. Her father expected her to be home around 3:15, like normal. He immediately knew something was off. She never took too long to get home, so he made a phone call to her mother, letting her know that Tamiqua still hadn't arrived. It was around 3:40 p.m. when Ernesto hung up the phone, and he heard a commotion in the hallway, the sounds of movement and voices. He rushed to the front of the door and opened up, and when he stepped outside, someone would tell him that a woman overdosed in the hallway and she was dead. She was lying on the stairs that led up to the roof. Ernesto's eyes focused on the person's body. She was lying face up, and that's when he saw a gold chain, a thumb ring, and a pair of sneakers. He'd seen them before. They belonged to Tamiqua. This wasn't a grown adult. It was his 11-year-old daughter, lying on the ground, nearly lifeless. He could barely recognize her because her face was covered in blood and bruises. The clothing helped ID her, but it was in disarray. Ernesto lost all composure and began to lose himself when he saw his little girl lying there. His screams brought others into the hallway out of their apartments. She was unconscious and only partially clothed. She was lying in her own vomit, and she had blood running down her legs. It appeared that she had been violated. As soon as authorities and EMS arrived, they saw a glimmer of hope for little Tamiqua. She was rushed to Montefiore Medical Center, and on the way there, EMS workers worked on her the entire time. But it was too late. She was pronounced dead shortly after arriving at the hospital. From one moment to the next, reality at 3225 Olinville flipped upside down, with nobody able to grasp what had just taken place. Word made its way around the building, and the details were shocking to everyone. Children who were just returning home, some of who knew Tamiqua, were immediately devastated by the news. The entire building and surrounding neighborhood was torn apart by the details as they poured out, and the evening went on. A long night filled with cries and distraught loved ones in complete disbelief. As the sun began to set over the Bronx, darkness blanketed the city, and many would rest their heads on this night thinking of what happened to Tamiqua, overwhelmed with a sense of confusion, shock, and fear, despite remaining strong, despite trying to tuck it away in the back of their heads. It was just far too soon, and there was still no explanation for who did this. Ernesto would wake up the next morning to the realization that this wasn't a bad dream. He would begin to cry when realizing his daughter really wasn't here anymore. The day after Tamiqua's life was taken, the Gutierrez household was filled with family and friends who all rushed there to provide support and learn of what happened. Her younger brother had a hard time sleeping that night, even though it was long past his bedtime. He was only 6 years old and too young to really understand everything happening. But what he did know was that his sister was gone. Support from the community meant a lot. Everyone from her classmates to co-workers visited the home to offer their condolences. Relatives who are as far as Puerto Rico immediately made the trip to the Bronx to be there. Even strangers visited the building when they heard the awful news. The front of the building had a large set of carnations in the shape of a heart that was hung above the front door. The inside of the building in the lobby had a memorial that was growing larger and larger by the hour, with many candles, flowers, balloons, and handwritten postcards and notes from her friends at school. The students who attended the same school were both devastated and terrified at what happened. Grief counselors were brought in to help the children cope. They were sent to both PS41 down the street and MS13, where she had been currently attending. The principal at MS13 knew how important it was for the kids to properly grieve. They had a testing class lined up for that day, but it was canceled. Instead, the students were given the chance to express their pain by writing letters and making art for Tamiqua, messages and artwork that described the good times when she was still here. They wanted to show how much they cared and already missed her. One poster read, "We will always love you. We hope you like it in heaven." Another said, "We miss you on the block. It's not the same without you, baby." The savage nature of the crime left a paralyzing fear in many parents and children who now had second thoughts about walking home alone. They feared entering their own buildings. They couldn't get it off their minds, and who could blame them? One kid was quoted as saying, "It feels like a dream. They're trying to tell you to cheer up, but it's not gonna work. Everybody's crying and screaming." Up to 100 kids would leave MS-113 that afternoon, making their way to Tamiqua's apartment to leave their creations. Outside of the building, big crowds gathered in the street, many from the area, others traveling from outside the borough to pay respects. News vans were parked near as reporters gave updates from the scene. Drivers and vehicles could be seen slowing down as they approached 3225. A neighbor sold shirts from a van in memory of Tamiqua, hoping to raise money to give to the family to help pay for funeral costs. Many wore the shirts with her face on it, sitting on cars and milk crates outside, waiting for any information on an arrest, hoping that police would quickly close in on the monster who did this. A $2,000 reward was put up for any information about Tamiqua's death. Friends and neighbors went around the area collecting funds, hoping to raise another $5,000 to add to the current reward. Children played in the street, briefly forgetting why they were there. The community coming together was a welcome distraction. Her family and the community demanded answers, but what they didn't know was that authorities already had their eyes on a suspect, and he was much closer than they thought. The afternoon Tamiqua's body was found, the investigation quickly began. They looked for anything that would help them retrace her last steps. They spent the rest of that day canvassing the area. It was here that in the courtyard in the back of the building, at the bottom of a trash can, detectives found a set of keys. Attached was a keychain that read, "Tammy." In another section of the courtyard, they found her book bag and a pair of earrings. It looked like someone had thrown them out of a window. When they went back to where her body was found, a trail of blood and vomit went from her body along the floor, and it led them to apartment 6E. The apartment door and door handle also had vomit on them. Police knocked on the door, and a man opened up. His name was Clarence Moss, a former Port Authority maintenance worker and a neighbor who lived only 2 doors down. They spoke to him and told him that a dead girl was found not too far from his front door, and there were signs that she might have been here. He denied knowing anything about any girl and said he was asleep when they knocked. It would be a little while later when Moss's wife got home from work, and detectives asked for permission to enter the apartment, to which she agreed. Moss again stated he wasn't aware of anyone being attacked or whatever took place, but one of the detectives with a sharp eye noticed a small drop of vomit on a mat. All signs led here. They would ask Moss to come with them to the police station for questioning, and surprisingly, he agreed. While he was being questioned at the station, detectives obtained a search warrant to further investigate the home. They returned to apartment 6E at 11:27 p.m. that night, and what they found was disturbing. They recovered a bed sheet, a sock, a pillowcase that were all stained with blood and vomit. They also made sure to cut the piece of mat where the drop of vomit was seen earlier. Moss was questioned for a total of 41 hours, where he tried to tell stories and denied having any role in this heinous attack. During the interrogation, detectives would also notice stains on Moss's pants and his sneakers. Those were also vomit, mixed with other DNA. The evidence was piling up. While all this was happening, a medical examiner was confirming a cause of death. They discovered that Tamiqua had been brutally violated, sodomized, and smothered with either a hand or a pillow. Her windpipe was crushed from the pressure being applied to her throat. The stains that were found on the items recovered were all tested for DNA, and it was confirmed that it was a direct match to Tamiqua. A blood sample was also taken from Moss that would ultimately be a match. After being questioned for nearly 2 days, Clarence Moss would confess to the crime and told them what took place. On the afternoon of May 8th of 2001, Tamiqua came to her building and got out of the 6th floor elevator like she did every day. But this time, she stopped at apartment 6E, 2 doors down. She knocked on the door and Moss opened. The reason for Tamiqua knocking on his door was that she was good friends with his grandson. He had been to Tamiqua's apartment plenty of times in the past to play, but she had never spent any time in Moss's apartment. According to her mother, she was never allowed to go over anyone's place without their knowledge, but she never went with that intention. She went there looking for her friend, looking to see if he would come over to play later, and it was Moss who pretended his grandson was home and brought her inside. He was said to be binging alcohol and high on crack the entire day. It was here that he took Tamiqua into the bedroom, where he violated her, beat her, and crushed her throat so she couldn't scream, in an attack they believe lasted about 30 minutes. He then tried to get rid of her belongings by throwing them out of his window into the courtyard, dumping her keys there later. He then carried her body from the room, out of the apartment, and into the building's hallway, attempting to drag her up the stairs so he could leave her on the roof. He heard someone coming and became startled, so he left her body halfway up before running back into his apartment, leaving her for dead, only feet away from her own front door. The most sickening crime that anyone here had ever been this close to. He was charged with first-degree murder as well as violating Tamiqua. After his confession, Moss was led out of the 47th precinct in handcuffs, and outside of the precinct were friends, neighbors, and strangers all screaming at the top of their lungs, calling him a murderer, reminding him of the monster he was. The anger and raw emotion couldn't be put into words. Everyone demanded that he pay. Before he did this, the building was known as a place where everyone was friendly and everyone was safe. Many rallied behind the family, expressing that this person needed to be punished for this. When Tamiqua's parents learned of who was responsible for taking their little girl's life, they were taken completely off guard and understandably very angry, and they felt vengeful. They couldn't believe that anyone would do this, especially the next door neighbor, someone they'd seen coming and going, who often said hello, someone whose grandson spent time in their home with their daughter a lot. Nobody expected this. His grandson spent so much time at Tamiqua's home that not too long before this, Tamiqua's mother put a stop to the visits, not because she felt anything was wrong, but because it was starting to disrupt the family's daily routine. She felt that some space was needed. The frequent visits from Moss's grandson is what likely made her feel so comfortable knocking on his door. There was no known danger, although there were moments where Tamiqua's mother would catch Moss staring at her and her daughter. But there were no other signs. All she could do is make sure that their children knew to be safe and keep their distance. Her heart was completely broken. She was quoted as saying, "Don't trust anyone, even if they're your friends. They ask what happened, and they say they're sorry, but it's so painful. I tell them, watch your kids. You never know what people are up to." Before this, her, Ernesto, their kids, they didn't have these fears, but the reality of the tragedy settled in fast. Word had already reached Tamiqua's parents about a neighbor being suspected before it was made public, but the official confirmation made it all too real. "How could he do that? How could he hurt my baby?" said Tamiqua's mother as she sat being interviewed, angrily clenching her teeth with tears in her eyes. The family now knew the truth of who did this, But the road to healing wouldn't be easy. It was only the beginning of dealing with this unbearable pain they all felt. Ernesto and Santa knew they had to remain strong for the rest of the children, and they did exactly that, fighting their way through all the different emotions and trying to remain focused on getting justice for their daughter, the hardest obstacle they would ever face. But more outrage would soon follow when details of Moss's criminal past were made public. It turns out that Moss had a criminal history that included arrests for assault, weapons possession, and other serious crimes, but one in particular stood out. In 1998, Moss faced a judge after he was charged with slashing a woman's throat. He was facing charges of attempted murder and aggravated assault, but for whatever reason, the Philadelphia judge would find him guilty of 2 lesser charges, and he was sentenced to only 4 years probation. The same judge would terminate Moss's probation a year and a half early, making him a free man. It was right after this that he moved to New York, to 3225 Olinville. This man shouldn't have been free, let alone living among neighbors as if this never happened. There was no history of violating children on his arrest record, but given his extremely violent past, anybody would think that maybe he could very likely do this again. It was only a few years before this that he mercilessly sliced someone's throat. He was an obvious danger to those around him. This negligence and carefree approach toward his sentencing back in 1998 is what made him a free man, free to commit this terrible crime. He had only lived at 3225 Olinville since the year before, a grave mistake that would cost young Tamiqua her life. A 2-day service was held for Tamiqua on Monday and Tuesday, May 14th and 15th of 2001, at Romano Funeral Home in the Bronx. Many wore shirts with Tamiqua's face on them, with the words, "Mom and Dad will always love you forever. Friends will always miss you." Some approached her small open casket and left mementos. Some left flowers, stuffed animals, pictures, class photos from her time at MS-113. Outside of the funeral home, a family friend gathered signatures for a petition that demanded the death penalty for Moss. They felt it's what he deserved. Others felt like this might be the easy way out and wanted him to suffer behind bars. It was clear how much Tamiqua meant to everyone. Her classmates had trouble sleeping after what happened, feeling like the same might happen to them one day, thinking of their friends' last moments and how cruel it all was. Students and friends appeared in droves, showing their support and expressing their sadness. On Wednesday, May 16th of 2001, a morning mass was held at Immaculate Conception Church in the Bronx, the same church that Tamiqua was baptized in back in 1990. Again, hundreds would arrive to pay their respects. Her small white casket was sprinkled with holy water by the Reverend as loved ones watched and cried. One of Tamiqua's friends recalls seeing her body in the casket and thinking to himself that he didn't recognize his friend. Many didn't want to believe that this had actually happened, even after attending her service. The grief was just too much to bear. Tamiqua's coffin was placed into a hearse and driven to St. Raymond's Cemetery, where she would be buried. Once Tamiqua was laid to rest, the battle wasn't over. Loved ones and friends would spend day in and day out trying to cope with the grief. And more than a year later, on Tuesday, September 3rd of 2002, a trial was underway. At first, Moss would try to get the evidence obtained on the evening Tamiqua was slain thrown out, stating that it had been illegally obtained since authorities didn't yet have a warrant to be entering his home. But this wouldn't work out in his favor because his wife voluntarily let them into the home, and when they collected the evidence later on that night, they did have a warrant. That evidence was here to stay, and the motion was denied. Tamiqua's parents gave tearful testimony of what had taken place, both of them hesitant at first, but fighting through the details, taking the stand for their daughter. DNA experts also took the stand to verify that everything found by detectives linked Tamiqua and Moss. There was no doubt that he did this. This was a crime he wouldn't get a slap on the wrist for either. He was found guilty of the murder and violation of Tamiqua Gutierrez, and since he wasn't sentenced to have his life terminated by the courts, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her parents would burst into tears when the sentencing was read. Tamiqua's loved ones were thankful that this monster would spend the rest of his days behind bars, but no amount of years or harsh sentencing could bring back their beloved Tammy. Still, finally, this chapter of their lives was over. Now, they could try their best to grieve in peace without this poor excuse for a human being able to enter their thoughts, not knowing if he would actually pay for this crime. Clarence Moss will never go free. His life will end behind those walls. What happened to Tamiqua that afternoon in May of 2001 could have and should have been avoided. This person already made a vicious attempt on someone else's life, and he was barely even punished for it. Had this man been in prison for the many reasons before this happened, he wouldn't have been free to commit this crime. The families at 3225 Olinville once had trust. Everyone knew of the dangers that lurked outdoors. But here, everyone was family, or so they thought. They couldn't have imagined that any of this would take place here. Anytime they walked through this lobby, took this elevator, walked up and down the stairs, they were reminded of Tamiqua's last moments alive, everything she went through, fighting for her life. The person who did this wasn't a total stranger. He was a neighbor, someone they thought was trustworthy, but they would never trust the same way again. Her family would move out of the building about a week after Tamiqua was slain. They couldn't bear to be reminded of what happened, walking by the very spot she was found. It was a cruel memory they had every intention of leaving behind. Some parents made sure their children were well aware of what had taken place to make sure they understood the importance of keeping to themselves. Tamiqua did nothing wrong. She was just a sweet girl looking to play with her friend like she always did. But the evil next door took advantage of that, leaving her family with a hole in their hearts they could never fill. Her mother and father had this to say after sentencing: "I thank God this comes to a close today. You murdered the most precious thing in my life. You should rot in jail for the rest of your life." Ernesto and his family know in their hearts that Tamiqua would have left a great impression on everyone. She would have been someone big in life had her life never been taken. She's very missed by the many friends she made, her siblings, her parents, and many aunts and uncles, all who still mourn her today. Tamiqua would have been 34 years old. Rest in peace, Tamiqua Gutierrez, and my deepest condolences go out to her family and loved ones. You aren't forgotten.